Nathan Kimball's brigade thundered through the Manassas Gap, having marched all the previous evening and night from Rectortown. The 8th Ohio Infantry led the advance, splitting into two sections and moving on the 12th Georgians in Front Royal. A brief cannon barrage sent the entire Confederate regiment into panic. The Georgians immediately abandoned their camp and fled north. A squad of the 1st Rhode Island Cavalry went forward in pursuit. The fleeing Confederates attempted to set fire to stores of supplies in town, but the Union forces managed to douse the flames before they spread across the town, an act for which the citizenry was grateful. The rebels set fire to the road bridge over the South Fork, but neglected to burn the railroad bridge. The Union cavalry pursuit was stopped by a volley between the forks of the river, but the commander of the Georgians, a Colonel Connor, had already fled north to Winchester. Back in town, hundreds of Union prisoners, mostly from the 1st Maryland Union Infantry, were freed. Altogether, about 150 rebels were captured, most from the 12th Georgia. That same day, a major thunderstorm broke, soaking everyone and impeding movement across the valley. Shields arrived in Front Royal by the late afternoon with the rest of his division, but was unable to reconnoiter beyond Cedarville due to Ashby's troopers. Meanwhile, Colonel Connor arrived in Winchester that evening, where he was called by General Jackson to answer for his actions. Cozens illustrates the scene in his book. Connor enters Jackson's office. "General, I suppose you have heard of my misfortune at Front Royal." "Yes." "Well, General, I did the best fighting I could, but we were overpowered." "How many men did you have killed?" "I had no men killed, General." "You call that fighting?" Jackson dismissed him from the room. Outside, Connor turned to Jackson's chief commissary officer and opined, quote, "Major, I believe General Jackson is crazy." Sandy Pendleton then emerged from the office and turned to Connor. "Colonel, consider yourself under arrest." Colonel Connor muttered, "Now I know he's crazy." Heavy rains continued through the night of the 30th. Jackson was in serious danger. With Shields' division of 11,000 at Front Royal and Fremont's army of almost 15,000 within a day's march from Strasburg, it was very likely that Jackson's army could have their route south cut off on the 31st. Unfortunately for the Union, on the 31st, Shields began to become afraid that Longstreet's division, which was actually at Richmond, had become detached and was already in the Page Valley. By that logic, Shields calculated that marching to Strasburg would expose his rear to attack. Thus, Shields did nothing all day. In the evening, the 8th Ohio, commanded by Colonel Samuel Carroll, drove off a small force of Ashby's troopers which had been blocking the road to Strasburg, but no Union commanders took advantage of this. At the same time, Fremont, in spite of his promises to arrive in Strasburg, also failed to arrive. The heavy rains had turned all roads to mud, and in spite of hard marching, by the evening, the lead elements of his army were still 5 miles from Strasburg. Jackson spent the day reassembling his scattered forces and beginning the retreat, with the wagon train stretching 7 miles down the valley pike. The army withdrew south all day. With the night falling, the army encamped between Cedar Creek and just north of Newton. That same day, the Battle of Seven Pines outside of Richmond had begun, and General Joseph E. Johnston had been seriously wounded. Disaster for the Confederacy in Richmond and in the Valley seemed very likely now. Very early in the morning on June 1st, Jackson sent Tolliver's brigade under Colonel Fulkerson a couple miles down the Moorfield Road as a heavy screen against any attempt by Fremont to advance on Strasburg and cut the valley pike. The skies finally cleared. Fighting between Union skirmishers and Fulkerson's force began at 7 a.m. The morning was tense with an artillery duel between the Federals and the rebels. However, Frémont's army did not press an attack. By noon, the Stonewall Brigade, the last of Jackson's army, had crossed Cedar Creek into Strasburg, and the feelings of dread started to abate. Meanwhile, in Front Royal, Irvin McDowell was waiting on Ord's division to arrive. He heard the distant sounds of the artillery duel but wasn't sure where it was coming from. Shields' division moved north to Cedarville, while the 13th Pennsylvania Reserves, known better as the Bucktails, moved to Strasburg with the 1st Pennsylvania Cavalry. They were halted by artillery fire and the sight of Jackson's legions on the Valley Pike heading south, and turned back across the North Fork Railroad Bridge. With the main army continuing the retreat south, the heavy rebel guard disengaged from Frémont's front and withdrew behind Jackson's force. Frémont, who had become afraid earlier in the day that Jackson had actually planned to attack him down the Moorfield Road, did not pursue. That afternoon, the heavy rains returned. Frémont sent his cavalry forward to probe for the enemy. Realizing that Jackson had slipped past the Federal forces, Shields came up with a plan to march down the parallel Page Valley and cut off Jackson's likely avenue of escape, Swift Run Gap, while Frémont pursued Jackson from behind. McDowell assented and Shields began marching down the Luray Road by 3 p.m. Shields sent Samuel Carroll and his 8th Ohioans forward to try and burn the bridge at Conrad's store. Meanwhile, that evening, Frémont's cavalry entered Strasburg, finding it empty. The troopers then continued south, surprising the 2nd and 6th Virginia Cavalry, who fled in a panic in the dark. Disorganized skirmishing continued between Union and Confederate cavalry around Fisher's Hill until the Federals finally disengaged, having taken 18 rebel prisoners. By nightfall, Shields' force had advanced 10 miles down the Luray Road. On this same day that Jackson had escaped capture, Robert E. Lee took command of the Army of Northern Virginia. June 2nd brought a new phase of warfare to the valley. Until now, the Union Army had made notable efforts to respect private property and avoid mass plundering. On June 2nd, Union troops, mostly Germans under Louis Blenker, began looting widely. Thousands of Union soldiers left the ranks to join in the pillaging. One Ohioan described the New York troops, quote, "We had a couple of brigades of New York Dutch who seldom marched in ranks, but like ravening wolves were in every home near the road. After stripping women and children of their clothing as well as of all their proceeds, leaving them entirely destitute of a living, they would kill a cow and get her young. They would gather up young suckling pigs and poultry and stuff them in their haversacks among their crackers, and would enter defenseless houses and threaten women with violence, providing they would not give them milk and butter and other things." General Milroy wrote, quote, "The Dutch brigades are composed of the most infernal robbers, plunderers, and thieves I have ever seen. Our army is disgraced by them. They straggle off from their companies and regiments for miles on each side of the road as we march along and enter every house, smokehouse, milkhouse, chicken house, kitchen, barn, corn crib, and stable, and clean out everything, frequently opening drawers, trunks, bureaus, etc. for plunder, leaving women and children crying behind them, but no treaties or entreaties stop or affect them." Blenker and his subordinate officers turned a blind eye to the looting. The renegade soldiers did not limit themselves to stealing from civilians either. Union quartermasters reported that their stores were cleaned out by Blenker's division. As Frémont marched in pursuit, his forces captured hundreds of exhausted stragglers that had fallen out on the hard march. In the pursuit, General George Stuart's poor command of the cavalry became all too evident. The Confederate cavalry rearguard was repeatedly sent running by Union troopers. Jackson finally had enough and relieved Stuart in favor of Ashby. Stuart returned to command the Maryland line. Jackson correctly guessed what Shields' force in the Page Valley was up to and sent a cavalry detachment to burn the Columbia and White House bridges to prevent Shields crossing the Massanutten Mountains and merging with Frémont. The Valley Pike was a macadamized road, but the Page Valley roads were all dirt, and the heavy rains of the previous days would undoubtedly have turned them all to mud. That night, Jackson's army encamped around Hawkinstown, just north of Mount Jackson, while Frémont's army was at Edinburgh. Shields managed to march 15 miles that day and found, to his dismay, that the Columbia and White House bridges had been destroyed. This disturbed Shields greatly, and his rationality began to crumble. The following day, June 3rd, Frémont secured a crossing over Stony Creek at Edinburgh and Mill Creek at Mount Jackson and continued his pursuit. Ashby was promoted to brigadier general. At Meem's Bottom, the rebels successfully destroyed the bridge over the North Fork behind them and continued further south. One rebel wrote of the march, "We have been on a retreat for 5 days, and an awful time it has been. I never saw so many barefoot men with their feet all swollen and bleeding. Hundreds and hundreds drag along the road." Rain continued pouring in the valley. Shields meanwhile continued losing his grip on reality, proposing a bizarre plan to cross the South Fork at Conrad's Store to Harrisonburg, then turn back and march on Stanardsville to destroy the rail depot there. McDowell appended a note to Shields' proposal to Secretary Stanton that dismissed the plan as fantasy. Jackson's army encamped between Rude's Hill and New Market that evening. Frémont's engineers worked through the night to build a new bridge over the North Fork. It was complete by morning, and Union troops had begun to cross when a new deluge swelled the banks of the river and wrecked the new bridge, cutting off the few troops that had made it across. The same day, another deluge took out the bridge over Stony Creek, cutting off Frémont's army from its supplies. The Federals had to resort to foraging the local countryside to subsist. Jackson, meanwhile, spent much of the day trying to find information on where Ewell's brigades were and how fit for combat they were, as well as deploying his troops on high ground west of New Market in response to a rumor that Frémont was going to try to cross the North Fork there. The same day, Shields found that the rebel detachment that had burned the bridges over the South Fork had also burned the bridge at Conrad's Store. The next possible crossing was at Port Republic. However, the Elk Run Creek south of the town was so swollen that no Union forces could go any further south until the waters receded. Shields' long mud march had also stretched his own supply lines, and his men began to run out of rations. At the same time, his grip on reality continued to slip. While nearly half of his division was without shoes, Shields continued to insist in telegrams to McDowell that he could vanquish Jackson. One telegram read, "I cannot fight against the elements, but give me bread to keep me alive and they will never leave this valley. Their force is inconsiderable, not, in my opinion, 7,000. I want hard bread, salt, sugar, and coffee. Send me those. I will stampede them down to Richmond if you give me plenty of bread." Feeling that Shields was hopeless to accomplish anything, McDowell took Ord's and King's divisions and left for Fredericksburg. Shields, meantime, ordered Carroll to secure the bridge at Port Republic, then advance on Staunton, Virginia with his brigade and wreck the rail infrastructure there to prevent Jackson's escape. That evening, Jackson's men stood down around New Market for a brief rest. Frémont's men resumed work on fixing the bridge over the North Fork after the waters receded and continued through the night. Shields' men encamped on soggy ground in and around Conrad's Store. At 1 a.m. on June 5th, Jackson roused his exhausted men and resumed the retreat. They marched all day with the supply trains crossing the North River and continuing to Staunton with the wounded. At Harrisonburg, however, Jackson turned his men onto the Port Republic Road. He had heard from intelligence reports by Hotchkiss that Shields was at Conrad's store and unable to advance any further. He formulated a plan to advance on Port Republic. There he could keep Frémont and Shields from being able to merge forces. If Frémont advanced on Staunton, Jackson could strike his flank. Frémont's men finally managed to throw a bridge over the North Fork. However, when he sent a message to McDowell asking him where he was and what his plans were, McDowell ordered that Frémont return George Bayard's cavalry and the elite bucktails that he had lent him. Frémont was determined to press on against Jackson but wanted reinforcements. He sent a message to Banks, who had recrossed the Potomac and was at Strasburg, to join him in his advance on Jackson. Unfortunately, Banks declined on account of a lack of supplies. Undeterred, Frémont continued on, arriving in Newmarket by the evening. Shields continued his bizarre behavior. Hearing a rumor that Longstreet was marching on the valley from Gordonsville through Stannardsville, Shields withdrew most of his division to Luray by the end of the day. By the end of the 5th, Jackson's infantry encamped on the road between Harrisonburg and a small hamlet named Cross Keys. At 5 a.m., Frémont resumed his pursuit of Jackson. However, Ashby's cavalry slowed their advance consistently all day. At Conrad's store, the waters of the Elk Run Creek began to subside. Carroll asked Shields for reinforcements with which to save the Port Republic Bridge. Shields sent him a few cavalrymen, but also relayed a strange request that Carroll plan an attack on the rail infrastructure at Waynesboro, neglecting to address his previous order to secure the Port Republic Bridge. Frémont started arriving in Harrisonburg by early afternoon, although he had no idea where Jackson had gone. A Union cavalry company, part of the 1st New Jersey Cavalry, began skirmishing with some of Ashby's troopers south of the city. Among the Union casualties was a British soldier of fortune, Percy Wyndham, who had fought all over Europe. He was taken prisoner after launching a charge that no one else in the 1st New Jersey Company followed. Instead, the Confederates countercharged and sent the 1st New Jersey fleeing back to Harrisonburg. By now it was past 6 p.m. When Frémont heard about the rout of the 1st New Jersey, he reinforced Bayard with more cavalry, but felt it was too late to start a major engagement. However, Colonel Thomas Kane, who had recruited the Bucktails and now commanded a battalion of them, asked Bayard for permission to advance on Ashby, hoping to both recover the wounded from the cavalry skirmish and restore the morale of the army after this small defeat. Bayard reluctantly acquiesced, and Kane led his battalion, about 150 men, down the Port Royal Road. 2 miles south of the city, Kane left the road and led his men into the cover of woods parallel to the road, hoping to ambush the cavalry he saw on a ridge on the road. However, Ashby had seen Kane's approach from the city and had gone back to Ewell to request infantry support, which came in the form of 2 regiments, the 1st Maryland and the 58th Virginia. Ewell also personally came to observe in case things went poorly. Ashby sent these 2 regiments into the woods, hoping to ambush Kane's men as they marched up the road. Neither side realized that they were on a collision course in the woods. Firing began before long, and the Bucktails moved to cover at the edge of the wood line by a clover field and engaged both rebel regiments. The 58th Virginia crumbled and fell back to the rear. Ashby, who had been personally leading the men from the front, had his horse shot out from under him. When he stood back up, he urged the Virginians to rally and ordered a charge, but none of them obeyed. Only 30 yards from the Bucktails, he was struck by a single bullet that traversed his body, and Turner Ashby was no more. Ewell, who was watching this debacle, immediately ordered Colonel Bradley Johnson, who commanded the 1st Maryland, to charge and sent the 44th Virginia to support them. The 58th Virginia reformed and re-entered the fight. Johnson wheeled his regiment to the right and crashed against the Bucktails' flank. After a brief, heavy fight, the Bucktails finally withdrew, having lost over half their men. Back in the city, the Federals were confident that they would soon defeat Jackson. Blenker's Germans continued their looting, stealing from every shop they could find. Ashby's body was carried to the rear in a tearful procession. It is likely that he was killed by friendly fire in the confusion of the battle. His death reverberated among the ranks. Fulkerson wrote of his death, quote, "He was the most gallant man I ever saw, and withal a good man. When Ashby was between us and the enemy, we felt perfectly secure against any surprise, and he was always on the enemy's heels. They had great fear of him. His place cannot be filled." Ewell spoke admiringly of Ashby and said that he would prefer to command a cavalry regiment than an infantry division. Jackson, despite his earlier tension and animosity with Ashby, wrote, quote, "As a partisan officer, I never knew his superior. His daring was proverbial, his powers of endurance almost incredible, his tone of character heroic, and his sagacity almost intuitive in divining the purposes and movements of the enemy." He appointed Colonel Thomas Munford as Ashby's successor. Now came June 7th. Frémont sent a patrol down the Port Republic Road and came across pickets half a mile from Cross Keys. In that area was Ewell's division of over 6,600 men, which the patrol reported as 20,000. Frémont called a council of war. He had concluded that Jackson had turned his force around to face him until he was able to withdraw through Port Republic. Unfortunately, Frémont's army was not in the best shape. Of the 14,050 men he had, less than 10,000 were fit for action. The troops were low on supplies, worn out, hungry, and poorly equipped. Nonetheless, Frémont was determined to attack and prepared his army to move at daybreak the following day. Ironically, back in Washington, Secretary Stanton was drafting orders to have Frémont remain put at Harrisonburg and for Shields to rejoin McDowell, who was now at Fredericksburg. Unfortunately, neither order would reach their respective commanders in time to prevent the coming battles. Jackson, meanwhile, rested his men that day. Ewell encamped his men at Cross Keys, while Jackson did so just half a mile northeast of Port Republic, making his personal headquarters at a home called Madison Hall. The same day, Carroll trudged on the road between Conrad's store and Port Republic. En route, he received another bizarre message from Shields. The general was convinced that Jackson's army was a shattered force being pressed by Frémont and needing only a quick attack to send them into a rout. Shields also accused Carroll's officers and men of hesitancy and of lacking aggression. He wrote, quote, "The Germans are not half as well off as you are, but they hang on the enemy without respite. This enemy insulted the capital of your country. He is in retreat. You are within a day and a half of him and you hesitate. I don't mean you personally, but some of your officers and men. This would be a disgrace. Can this be my boasted Shields' division?" He continued by stating that Tyler's brigade and artillery reinforcements were en route to reinforce him, and that he expected Carroll to reach Port Republic by that evening and Waynesboro the next day. He also reiterated his order to save the bridge at all costs, contradicting his orders just a few days before to burn it. This may have been due to a personal jealousy between him and Frémont. In any case, Frémont drove his men through the evening and into the night. The following day would see much action between Jackson and his Union pursuers.